Realistically, what can ordinary people actually do after the Epstein files released to push for real accountability? The day the files hit the headlines, the city looked normal. Traffic, coffee lines, neon ads promising comfort. But inside Ethan's chest, something tightened with every refresh of his phone. Names, dates, implications. Commentators argued in circles until the words turned into static. That night, he walked to the corner store and stared at a shelf of glossy products that suddenly looked like badges, familiar brands, familiar billionaires. The cashier rang up his usual basket, and the total appeared like a dare. Ethan's hand hovered over his card. He thought about how furious he was, and how by tomorrow the feed would slide to the next outrage. He imagined the people he blamed, insulated behind lawyers and gates, waiting out the storm like they always did. He imagined himself, another person yelling into the dark. "Need a bag?" the cashier asked. Ethan looked at his purchases again, a soda he didn't need, a streaming gift card he always bought just in case, a magazine packed with ads for things built to be replaced. The total wasn't huge, but it felt heavy, like paying to be ignored. He set the soda back, then the gift card, then the magazine. The cashier blinked. "You sure?" Ethan nodded. "Just the essentials." Outside, rain started to fall, soft at first, then harder, the kind that makes you walk faster without realizing. Ethan stood under the awning and opened his phone. He found the subscription page he'd never visited, the one that hid behind 3 taps and an "Are you sure?" prompt. Cancel, confirm, cancel, confirm. Each click was small until he imagined thousands doing the same thing on the same night. Numbers dipping in a corporate dashboard, an analyst squinting, an executive asking why. His phone buzzed, a friend's message. "This will blow over." Ethan typed back, "Only if we keep paying for it." He stepped into the rain and walked home, lighter by a few dollars, heavier with an idea. The first protest wasn't a sign or a chant. It was a receipt that finally read, "No." Next story. The first dump of documents landed like a thunderclap, and by lunch, the internet had already started to move on. Clips became memes, memes became jokes, jokes became silence. Claire refused to let it fade. She printed 3 pages and spread them on her kitchen table like evidence. Redactions, thick black bars swallowing paragraphs, dates that ended mid-sentence. The story felt like someone had ripped the final chapters out of a book and told the world to be grateful for the cover. Her brother shrugged. "What can we do? They'll release what they want." Claire searched for her representative's office number. The first call rang out. The second went to a cheerful voicemail that promised her message mattered. The third didn't connect at all. She kept calling. By evening, she had an email saved. 1 paragraph, plain language, no insults. Release what remains. Unredact what can be unredacted. Protect victims with placeholders, not blackouts. She sent it to every office that claimed to care about transparency, then forwarded it to her local news tip line. 2 days later, she tried the district office in person. A young staffer met her at the door with a practiced smile, trained to absorb urgency and offer nothing back. "We've had a lot of calls," the staffer said. "Good," Claire replied. "You'll have more." On the walk home, she noticed the pattern. Everyone was waiting for the story to get boring, waiting for people to feel silly for still caring, waiting for fatigue to do what threats couldn't. That night, she opened a group chat with friends who usually argued about movies. She sent a short list. Call, email, show up. Then one more line. "If you can't get through, say that out loud. Make the silence visible." A friend replied, "Feels pointless." Claire looked at the blacked-out pages on her table. Pointless was exactly what the system needed her to believe. She typed, "They're counting on you to stop," and hit send again and again until the story had no choice but to stay alive. Next story. When the news cycle started to cool, Jordan felt the familiar itch of helplessness. Everyone around him had a theory, a hashtag, a hot take, and then they went back to work, back to errands, back to pretending the world wasn't built to swallow outrage whole. At the warehouse, the line moved like a metronome. Boxes, scans, beeps, the supervisor's clipboard. Jordan thought, if we're powerless, why does everything depend on us showing up? On his lunch break, he sat behind the building and opened a spreadsheet he'd started in secret. Not conspiracy stuff, practical stuff. Names of co-workers who'd complained about rent, who'd missed a shift because their kid was sick, who'd been written up for being 5 minutes late after a 2-hour bus ride. He messaged the first person on the list, "If we ever had to stop work for one day, who would cover your groceries?" The reply came fast. "No one. That's why it'll never happen." Jordan stared at the words. That was the trap. You can't strike because you need money. You need money because you can't strike. So he started small. A mutual aid jar at the end of the break room table. Cash, grocery cards, diapers, whatever people could spare. He framed it as emergency help, not rebellion. It filled slowly, but it filled. He hosted quiet meetups at the park on Sundays. No speeches, just plans. Childcare swaps, rides to work, shared meals, a list of clinics, a binder of tenant rights, the kind of community that makes fear less useful. Weeks passed. The jar grew. The group chat grew. The idea grew teeth. Then, one Friday, the supervisor announced mandatory overtime until further notice. Groans rolled across the floor like thunder. Jordan felt the moment tilt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He texted the group, "If we ever do it, it won't start with anger. It'll start with readiness." Replies flooded in, one after another, until his screen looked like a countdown. And Jordan realized the scary part wasn't striking. The scary part was that it might finally be possible. Next story. On election day, Rachel stood in line with a coffee that had gone cold and a stomach that wouldn't settle. The people around her joked about traffic, complained about the weather, talked like this was just another Tuesday. She kept thinking about the names on the ballot. They were the same names she'd seen her whole adult life, smiling in glossy mailers, shaking hands at staged photo ops, promising the same repairs to a system that never seemed to get fixed. Every scandal came with the same apology. Every apology came with the same re-election. Ahead of her, an older man turned and said, "Doesn't matter who wins, nothing changes." Rachel almost agreed, almost. Inside the booth, the paper felt heavier than it should. Rachel traced the familiar names with her eyes and remembered how outrage always faded into a shrug, like accountability was a myth adults told children. Her phone buzzed, a friend texting, "Just pick the lesser evil and move on." Rachel stared at the list again. She realized what she'd been doing for years. Voting out of habit, voting out of fear, voting like she was renting her voice month to month instead of owning it. She took a slow breath and looked for the challengers, people without famous last names, people whose flyers had been photocopied instead of professionally designed. She didn't know if they were perfect. She didn't even know if they could win. But she knew one thing with startling clarity. The incumbents already had their chance. Their someday had lasted decades. Her pen hovered over the oval. For a second, it felt like stepping off a ledge with no guarantee the ground would be there. Then she filled it in, clean and dark. Walking out, Rachel didn't feel triumphant. She felt nervous, like she'd done something the system didn't want her to remember she could do. Outside, the older man was still talking. "Nothing changes," he said again. Rachel pressed her "I voted" sticker onto her jacket and thought, not if we keep choosing the same story. And for the first time, she'd written a different ending. Next story. When Lauren was a kid, her father used to say, "Public trust is fragile. One crack and it shatters." He said it like a law of nature. People vanished for the smallest misstep. Anchors spoke with righteous certainty. Apologies sounded like funerals. Now, Lauren watched the same kind of headlines scroll by, and nothing happened. At the office, co-workers played clips with the volume low like background music. Someone rolled their eyes. Someone said, "That's just how it is," and went back to spreadsheets. Lauren tried to argue, but her words bounced off invisible walls. Standards, she realized, hadn't disappeared overnight. They'd been eroded, grain by grain, until outrage felt childish and cynicism felt mature. That night, she visited her parents. Her father sat in his recliner, the news muted, captions crawling across the screen. A scandal, another denial, another moving forward. "Do you remember when this would have ended someone?" Lauren asked. He didn't answer at first. He stared at the captions, jaw tight, as if he were reading an obituary. Finally, he said, "I remember when people believed consequences were real." Lauren pulled up old clips, figures pushed out over a single sentence, a single rumor, a single gesture. The difference wasn't the wrongdoing. It was the audience. She leaned in, suddenly afraid of what the next decade would normalize. If this didn't matter, what would? How far would the line move before anyone noticed they were stepping over it? Her phone buzzed, a fundraising email from someone outraged by the very thing they refused to punish. Lauren's stomach dropped. Outrage had become a product, sold in subject lines and emptied out the moment the card cleared. She looked at her father. So what do we do? He turned the sound up just enough to hear the anchor's voice, smooth and bored. We stop pretending it's normal, he said. We make it expensive again. Lauren stared at the screen, at the smiling face that expected forgiveness by default. The real horror wasn't what had happened. It was how quickly everyone learned to live with it. Next story. The city ran on routines nobody noticed until they broke. Trains arrived, lights changed, trash disappeared. People called it normal, like normal was guaranteed. Jenna, a paramedic, knew better. She watched powerful names survive every wave of outrage like they were coated in something slippery. She watched patients come in with stress so heavy it looked physical, tight chests, clenched jaws, insomnia under their eyes. And she watched speeches about healing while the people doing the healing worked double shifts. One night, after a brutal call, Jenna sat in the ambulance bay and scrolled the headlines. Another release, another debate, another promise that someone would be held accountable if proven. Rage rose, and the ache of knowing rage alone didn't move policy. Her partner leaned against the rig. People keep saying strike, he said, like it's easy. Jenna stared at the hospital doors. Behind them were nurses who couldn't afford to miss a paycheck, janitors who'd be fired for being late, techs who worked overtime just to keep rent paid. Not easy, Jenna said, but it's the only language they can't ignore. In the break room, she started asking questions. Who could trade childcare for a day? Who could share rides? Who had a couch if rent went sideways? It sounded like community, not rebellion. Fear thrives on isolation. Weeks later, the hospital announced cuts. Fewer staff, same workload. The memo was read aloud. People cursed. People laughed bitterly. People looked down at their shoes like they were already defeated. Jenna raised her hand. What if we don't take it? A nurse whispered. We'll get replaced. Jenna nodded. Maybe, but if the city stops, buses, warehouses, clinics, schools, who replaces all of us at once? The room went quiet, but it changed shape. It wasn't surrender. It was calculation. On her way home, Jenna passed storefronts and thought about the phrase everyone repeated. Nothing we do matters. She pictured the city as a machine, humming only because ordinary hands kept turning its gears. The suspense wasn't whether a strike would hurt. It was whether people would finally remember how much power they were already holding. Next story. Marcus's living room used to be a shrine to comfort. A team jersey on the wall, a framed concert poster, a shelf of branded merch that made him feel like he belonged to something bigger than work and bills. Then the name appeared. It slid across his screen between ads and jokes. Casual, almost polite. Marcus reread it 3 times, waiting for his brain to reject it. Surely not him. Surely not the guy who made speeches about values. Surely not the one whose songs got Marcus through his dad's funeral. He tried to find a clean explanation. Misreporting. A smear. But the more he read, the more his excuses sounded like prayers. That night his friends came over for the game. The TV blared and the room filled with laughter, until an ad came on featuring the same face, the same grin, the same brand. No one spoke for a beat, like the whole room had stepped onto thin ice. His friend Nate shrugged. So what? Everyone's dirty. Doesn't mean I'm giving up my team. Marcus stared at the jersey on the wall. He thought about how power works, not just through laws and money, but through fans who keep clapping, through audiences who reward charm more than character. He walked to the shelf and picked up the merch. Soft, harmless-looking, expensive. A piece of identity that suddenly felt like evidence. You're being dramatic, someone muttered. Marcus didn't argue. He opened a drawer and set the merch inside, one item at a time like he was locking away a weapon. Then he pulled out his phone and canceled the season package he'd renewed without thinking. The confirmation page popped up. You will lose access immediately. For a second, he hesitated. Losing access was easy. Losing the story he'd told himself about heroes, about trust, hurt. He hit confirm. The game kept playing. His friends kept talking. But Marcus felt something quiet and sharp settle into place. If you keep rewarding people who do serious wrongs, you teach them the cost is worth it. and he was done paying tuition to their immunity. Next story. The boycott didn't start with a march. It started with a torn sleeve. Paige noticed it while packing for work, an ugly rip near the cuff of her favorite hoodie. Normally, she would have sighed, opened an app, and replaced it in 2 minutes. The kind of purchase that felt too small to matter. But after the latest news, too small to matter sounded like the lie everything depended on. She sat at her kitchen table with needle and thread she hadn't touched since school. The apartment was quiet except for the heater clicking on and off. The first stitch was clumsy. The second was worse. Her hands shook with impatience, the same impatience that made scrolling feel easier than fixing. When she finished, the seam looked crooked, but it held. Paige smiled like she'd won a tiny fight. Next came her phone. The battery had been dying for months. The screen cracked at one corner. She'd been eyeing the newest model. Instead, she bought a case, a screen protector, and a power bank. It felt almost embarrassing, like showing up to a party in last year's clothes. At lunch, a coworker teased her. "You're really doing the no-buy thing?" Paige shrugged. "Just trying to keep my money from going places I don't trust." That evening, she canceled subscriptions she forgot she had. One by one, the apps begged her to stay. "We'll miss you. Here's a discount." "Are you sure?" They sounded like X's. She started looking for alternatives, local shops, secondhand markets, software that didn't treat her attention like a mine. It was slower, less shiny, but every choice felt deliberate, like turning the volume down on a machine that thrived on impulse. A week later, she checked her bank balance and realized she wasn't poorer. She was calmer, less pulled. Her friends asked if it would change anything. Paige ran her thumb over the crooked seam on her sleeve. "Maybe not alone," she said, "but if enough of us stop feeding it, they'll notice the hunger." And for the first time, the future didn't feel inevitable. It felt negotiable. Next story. The pages looked like they'd been attacked with ink. Cole printed them anyway. On the kitchen counter, the documents were a mosaic of white margins and thick black rectangles. Whole paragraphs vanished. Whole pages were nothing but silence. His sister leaned over his shoulder. "Maybe they're protecting victims." "Then why blank everything?" Cole asked. "Why erase the story itself?" He wasn't naive. He knew some names needed protection, but this didn't feel careful. It felt like a curtain. He laid the pages side by side and tried to follow the thread. A date here, a location there, a sentence that started strong and then black. It was like listening to someone confess through a wall. Cole opened his laptop and drafted an email to his senator's office. Simple language: release what remains, replace victims' names with placeholders if needed, stop blacking out entire sections. Transparency isn't a slogan, it's a record. He sent it to every office he could find and forwarded it to local reporters. The replies were automatic. "Thank you for your message. We value your feedback." A week later, another batch dropped. Cole refreshed with the focus of a gambler, hoping for clarity. More black bars. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just redaction, it was choreography. Show enough to claim openness, hide enough to prevent consequences, give the public a puzzle with half the pieces missing, then call them unreasonable for not solving it. He tapped a fully blacked-out page. "If we accept this," he told his sister, "we're accepting a world where the truth is optional." She asked, "So what now?" Cole held up the page and opened his phone. He recorded a short clip. No rant, no theory, just the paper filling the frame. A solid wall of black. "This is what they call transparency," he said. He posted it, tagged the offices, tagged journalists, and watched the views climb. For the first time, the black bars didn't feel like the end of the story. They felt like proof someone was afraid of what the words could do. Next story. The strike started on a Monday, which felt almost polite. Ben noticed it on his walk to work, the first trash bag sitting beside the curb like a small mistake. By Tuesday, every house on the block had a pile. By Wednesday, the air itself changed, sweet, sour, stubborn, creeping into open windows and clinging to clothes. People complained, but the complaints had an edge now. You could ignore a headline. You couldn't ignore the smell. At City Hall, officials called it unfortunate. They asked residents for patience. They promised ongoing negotiations. Ben watched on his phone and laughed without humor. Patience was always the solution when regular people were suffering. By day 5, the piles were mountains. Seagulls fought over scraps. Rats moved like shadows along the gutters. The town that used to look tidy and controlled began to look honest. Ben texted a friend who worked sanitation. "They're trying to wait us out," his friend wrote. "They think we'll crack first." "Will you?" Ben asked. A pause. "Not this time." That weekend, a wedding was scheduled at the waterfront park. The venue called City Hall furious. A restaurant owner threatened to close. Parents posted videos of trash avalanches. Tourists arrived, saw the streets, and left. Suddenly, the mayor's tone changed. It wasn't anger or compassion. It was panic, because the strike had done what protests rarely did. It had reached the people who usually didn't have to look. On Monday morning, the alert hit. Tentative agreement reached. Ben watched the first sanitation truck rumble down the street. Workers in reflective vests jumped off, moving fast, efficient, exhausted. The mountains began to shrink. His neighbor leaned over the fence. "Amazing what they can solve when they want to." Ben nodded, but his stomach stayed tight. The lesson felt bigger than trash. If one overlooked group could bring a town to its knees in a week, without violence, then the system wasn't as unmovable as everyone pretended. It was just insulated, and insulation fails the moment you force the heat to show. Next story. When the email arrived, it looked like a miracle. "Exclusive opportunity," the subject line said. "Private mentorship, elite networking." It named a donor with a polished reputation and a smile that showed up in charity photos. For Diane's daughter, Emma, it promised access, internships, scholarships, doors that rarely opened for ordinary families. At dinner, Emma's eyes shone. "Mom, this could change everything." Diane wanted to say yes. She wanted to hand her daughter a future that didn't feel like climbing with bare hands. But the recent revelations had put a new filter over every promise made by power. Diane kept hearing a warning she couldn't ignore. Access is never free. Someone always pays. The next day, Diane joined the informational meeting on Zoom. The host's voice was warm, the slides glossy, the chat full of parents typing grateful emojis. Then, near the end, the host said, almost casually, "This program works best when students are flexible. Private dinners, weekend retreats, one-on-one time with mentors." Diane felt her spine stiffen. She pictured a teenager wanting to impress, wanting to be chosen, wanting to seem mature. She pictured a room where no felt like ruining your own chance. When the host asked for questions, Diane unmuted. "What safeguards do you have?" she asked. "Clear supervision, written policies, independent oversight?" The smile on the host's face didn't change, but something in the eyes did. "We've never had an issue," the host said. "We're like family." Diane closed her laptop slowly, as if sudden movement would break something. That evening she sat with Emma and spoke carefully. "There are doors you don't walk through just because they're open," she said, "especially when the person holding the key gets to decide what it costs." Emma's excitement dimmed, replaced by confusion, then anger, then a quiet, hard understanding. Diane didn't feel triumphant. She felt scared. Because the hardest part of protecting your child isn't fighting monsters in the dark, it's recognizing the ones who wear light like perfume. Next story. The idea started as a joke in a group chat. "We should all just go to Washington." By midnight, it wasn't a joke anymore. Lucas watched the conversation turn into planning. Train schedules, bus tickets, maps of public plazas, reminders to stay calm. He'd protested before and watched the news cycle swallow it whole. This felt different because it wasn't about being seen for one afternoon. It was about showing up until someone had to answer. On Friday, Lucas boarded an overnight bus with a backpack and a knot in his stomach. Around him were strangers with ordinary faces and ordinary exhaustion. A woman across the aisle asked, "You nervous?" Lucas nodded. "I'm worried it won't matter." She smiled without humor. "I'm worried it will." At dawn, the skyline appeared, pale and sharp. The group met near the station and walked together, quiet at first, then louder as more people joined. Not a mob, more like a river, gathering tributaries. When they reached the steps, Lucas expected chaos. Instead, he saw order. Volunteers handing out water, medics in bright vests, people reminding each other to stay peaceful and record everything. The kind of discipline that makes it hard to dismiss you as just angry. Phones rose, cameras rolled, names were read, questions were asked. The crowd waited for something that didn't sound like a script. Hours passed. Officials appeared on balconies and vanished. Barriers held. Doors stayed closed. Lucas felt the old despair creep in until he noticed the reporters. Not one camera, Many. The crowd had become too big to ignore, too steady to wait out in a single afternoon. A chant started, low and rhythmic. Not hate, not threats, just a demand repeated until it felt like pressure. Answer! 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 Lucas looked at the sealed doors and realized the suspense wasn't whether they'd open today. It was whether the people outside would keep coming back tomorrow. And from the way the crowd held its ground, calm, stubborn, united, he suspected they would.